I'm going to give you two quotes, and I want you to just try and decide which one sounds more like something Jesus would say than the other. All right? So, quote number 1. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. Quote number 1. Quote number 2. I did not come to bring a sword, but to bring peace. Number 2. Which one sounds more like something Jesus would say? Is he the peace guy or is he the sword guy? Not a rhetorical question. You can answer it. You would think he's the peace guy. But look at Matthew chapter 10, verse 34. And this is a surprising, a shocking, and a sharp statement from the lips of Jesus. Matthew 10, verse 34. He says, don't suppose I have come to bring peace to the earth. Now that sounds weird because that's exactly what I suppose Jesus should do. Jesus says, don't suppose that. He carries on, I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. He's the sword guy. Now we tend to think of Jesus as long blonde hair, nice blue eyes, surrounded by little children and lovely fluffy lambs. But here's Jesus tooled up. He's carrying. This is sword carrying Jesus. You get Barbies, don't you, with different names? Like Hairdresser Barbie and Barbados Barbie and other names like that. Here's sword carrying Jesus, if you're selling him in a toy shop. But this is not a sword that he's stabbing folk with. It's a sword that he is dividing people with. Or it's not that he's destroying people with a sword, but he is dividing, separating people. It's a sword that creates distinctions. So you here, you here. So if you're at Hampden on Monday night, Scotland fans there, Denmark fans there. Or politicians who get an 80 grand salary and can work extra jobs that are millions here. Folk on universal credit that are getting 20 quid a week taken off them by those same politicians over here. Cat people over here. Sane people over here. So he is dividing. We need to have this picture of sword-carrying Jesus in our heads as we come to what he's going to say in Matthew chapter 10, because there is a sharpness to it. We might not like what he says to us this morning, because what he says is going to be like a sword that divides people in this room this morning. To follow what Jesus says here is going to create divisions in your family and in our community. And to feel the sharpness of that, we're going to ask 3 questions. Just one after the other. So let's read from Matthew 10, verse 32 to 33 for the first question. Jesus says, verse 32, whoever acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. Here's question number 1. Are you acknowledging Jesus before others? Jesus knows that there will be a choice to be made by people who are following him. A choice between either acknowledging him in front of other people or disowning him in front of the other people. And he knows that that choice is going to be costly. That if you acknowledge Jesus before other people, there will be a high cost. Which means the temptation to disown him will be very real. If you were here last week, you will have heard Tim tell us that for Jesus' followers in this world, it is unlikely to be a peaceful place. They'll have to face their fears. Which is why in the last episode, Jesus 3 times says, do not be afraid of them. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. But you know what? To those same followers that Jesus said, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. By the end of Matthew's Gospel, one of Jesus' tightest lads will have said 3 times, I don't know him. I don't know the man. I don't know the man. The choice is clear, the fear is real, and the cost will be high. And Jesus is asking us this morning, when the choice comes amongst your family, or in your workplace, or at the office, or in the changing room, will you acknowledge Jesus, or will you disown him? Will you blush, or will you be bold? Jesus is using his sword here to draw a distinction, but it's a distinction between Christians here and Christians here. It's as if Jesus is asking us, do you think you can call yourself a Christ one if you never chat about the Christ? I wonder what side of the distinction we fall. Because Jesus then uses that same sword to divide Christians and Christians, to draw a line between what we say on earth and what he says in heaven. You see that? If you acknowledge him before others on earth, he says he will acknowledge you before his Father in heaven. Now that's not saying that we get saved by speaking about him, but it is saying that saved people will speak about him. And for those who are boldly acknowledging Jesus on earth, he gives the big assurance that he will speak their name before his Father in heaven. The cost may be high, but the reward's worth it. But here's the sharp side of the sword. For those who disown him before others on earth, he will disown you before his Father in heaven. To call yourself a Christian, but to continually and constantly disown him on earth, is to deceive yourself. There's no assurance that Jesus will speak for you on heaven if you don't speak for him on earth. Here's the first dividing line, and it is sharp, isn't it? Acknowledge him here. Disown him here. And in fact, it's stronger than that. Acknowledge him, heaven. Disown him, hell. The cost of acknowledging him may be high, but the cost of disowning him will be higher in eternity. And so maybe actually we just need to take a moment as Christians to own our disowning of Jesus, to confess it to him. Maybe we need to admit that there's some people that we have not acknowledged Jesus in front of them, that we've blushed more than we've been bold. Maybe we need to pray for the Spirit's help to turn our blushes into boldness. In fact, maybe we just need to take a moment now. This is a time where we need to do business with God. So maybe even just for a minute now, let's take a moment's silence before you and him. Maybe to say sorry. And maybe just to ask for his help. Maybe to pray for a specific person that you know you need to acknowledge Jesus in front of them. Let's take a moment before we move on. So question number 1, are we acknowledging Jesus before others? Question number 2 comes from verses 34 to 37, so let's read them together. First, verse 34, do not suppose I've come to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I've come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Question number 2. Do you love Jesus more than anyone else? And the first question was a division between Christians and Christians. This is more a question that divides between Christians and our community. Jesus has just said that he knows the cost of following him will be high. And now he makes explicit that the cost of following him might be that it creates enemies within your own family. Now, the language of family is everywhere. See if you just look back at your Bible again. Verse 32, it starts with a Father in heaven. Verse 33, a Father in heaven. But then verse 35, you've got father, daughter, mother, daughter-in-law, mother-in-law. Verse 36, the members of your household. Verse 37, father, mother, son, daughter. Right? There's loads of family language. But Jesus' thought again is creating a distinction between a Christian at peace with their Father in heaven and a Christian who's now at enmity with their family on earth. You see that? See, when you become a Christian, what happens is you change. Something deep inside of you has transformed. But if your family don't become Christians at the same time as you, then it instantly creates a division. You getting saved is like a sword that divides. What held you all together was your family. But now what sets you apart is your Father in heaven. And Jesus knows or he can create a tension in families that will push and strain relationships to the point of breaking. That's what lots of us in this room are living with. Maybe the only Christian in your house, maybe the only Christian in your family. It's the challenge of a relationship where one person is a Christian and the other isn't. And that's where what Jesus says in verse 37 can start to grate. Look at it again. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. So think of just a human relationship between two people. I love you more than anyone. I love you more than anyone. It's beautiful. But then something changes. One of them becomes a Christian. I love you more than anyone. I love Jesus more than anyone. I love Jesus more than you. And all of a sudden, it's unbalanced. Or use the language the Bible would use, it's like being unequally yoked. You're still family, still love each other, but all of a sudden Jesus appears as a little gooseberry that makes the whole thing feel slightly weird in a way that it never was before. Now, in some little way, there's division. Maybe even as strong as saying, enmity. So the Christian in the house or the Christian relationship, because Jesus has changed them, has different priorities from what they had before. All of a sudden, they want to give more money away than they used to, or use the house for more hospitality than they ever have before, or maybe spend more time at things at church, or maybe no longer want to have sex outside of marriage, or maybe want to parent the kids in a different way. And all of a sudden, a happy household is a divided household. And at some level, family are now enemies. Now, let me speak to you this morning, especially if you're not a Christian. Because I'm aware I've now just called you an enemy. And I get that can feel very strong. And it can be hard to hear that your mum or your dad or your brother or your sister, your partner, your husband or your wife loves someone more than they love you. But you mustn't miss what's significant here about what it means to be a Christian. All right? Being a Christian is not just the changing of some behaviors or the attending of some religious meetings. Being a Christian is something that changes you from the inside out. It's something that is the possession of someone's heart that then impacts everything about who they are. And do you know why that is? It's because our sin against God is not just a list of things that we've not done, but our sin is a person that we have not loved with our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Now, some of us know from our own brokenness that actually the members of our household have been the ones who have hurt us and abused us the most. And so actually to hear, unless you love Jesus more than you love my dad, actually it's not a hard thing, because my dad was a whatever. But you know, if you've been hurt by a member of your family, that some of the hurt is not just from the scars of what they did to us, but from the love that they ought to have had for us. They should have loved us, but they didn't. And if you feel that, it's a little taste of what we have done against God. Our love for him should have been with our everything, but the reality is, for most of our life, we've barely given him anything. And so, although you may be called an enemy here, what you need to realize is the most significant thing for you this morning is not that you've been called an enemy of someone within your own household, but that you are living as an enemy of God. The urgent thing is that you need to see that the most amazing thing about what we believe in Jesus is that when we were still God's enemies, he still loved us enough to send his one and only Son to suffer the death of an enemy on the cross so that you can be called God's friend. And the most pressing thing you need to do today is to fall on your knees and plead that God would forgive you of your lack of love for him, and now to start loving him more than anything else you have ever loved. And you know, putting your faith in Jesus today will not just unite you with a heavenly Father who's loved you like no one else will love you, but actually it might unite your family in a new way as well. But let me speak to you if you are a Christian. Because although for a non-Christian it might feel hard to be called an enemy, I think for a Christian, you look at these first two questions. Have you acknowledged Jesus before others? Have you loved him more than anything else? The answers to those questions, how do they make you feel? Because for me this week, they've covered me in shame. And they've made me feel guilty. Do you know what? They've made me feel like Peter when he heard the cockerel crow after he just said 3 times, "Don't know you. I don't know the man. I don't know the man." And I've found myself wallowing in my unworthiness this week. I've not always acknowledged Jesus when I could have, and I've not loved him as I should have. And I feel like Peter, who failed the first question by not acknowledging Jesus, and failed the second question by loving himself more than Jesus. And I stand here and I look at Jesus' words where he says, "You are not worthy of me," and I say, "I am not worthy of him." Anyone else feel that? Here's the amazing thing. Peter wallows in his unworthiness. And after Jesus has died on the cross for unworthy sinners like Peter, and had risen from the dead to promise new life to people like Peter, Peter sees Jesus walking towards him. What do you think Peter was expecting to hear from the lips of Jesus? Jesus could have quoted, "You did not acknowledge me before others. I am not going to acknowledge you before God." But you know what Jesus asks Peter 3 times? Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Jesus does not use our failures as an opportunity to embarrass us or to put us in his debt. He simply comes and he asks, "Do you love me?" See, the cost of following Jesus may be high, but loving him in moments like that isn't hard. Because he loved me enough to die for me when I was utterly unworthy, and so he is utterly worthy of my love. Ask Sarah, ask Reuben, ask them if I am hard to love. In fact, you don't even need to ask them. You know. He's a hard guy to love. That is never true of Jesus. Asking me to love Jesus is like asking me to love puppies, or Ben and Jerry's, or beautiful views. It's not a hard thing. No one else has loved me like he's loved me, and no one deserves my love more than him. And I think what Peter tells us is, sometimes it's our moments of greatest unworthiness that show us even more of the worthiness of Jesus. And we end up loving him even more. And what you see in Peter is, he goes from a fearful denier to a faithful preacher. Because when you love Jesus even more, your mouth cannot help but speak about him more. Do you love him? I love him. So will we acknowledge him? Oh, I want to say yes. Third question. And I'm afraid we're getting more intense as we go. All right? So let's read last one, verses 38 to 39. Jesus continues, "Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it. And whoever loses their life for my sake will find it." Here's question 3. Are you taking up your cross and following Jesus? Now the movement between the second and third is, the second one is, who is worthy of your love? This question is about what are you willing to lose? And the questions are increasing in their intensity. So acknowledging Jesus before others might give you the shakes. Thinking of family becoming enemies might make you rightly sob. But actually, language of taking up your cross should make you shudder. We're so far removed from the Roman world that we see a cross around someone's neck on a thing, or on the wall of a church, or on someone's tattoo, and we don't even blink. But actually, to hear the language of a cross back when Jesus mentions it would have produced absolute terror. It was an absolutely savage and slow death. And it had the idea of shameful social stigma. So when you heard the word cross, this is what you thought. You thought of death inflicted as painfully as possible, as slowly as possible, and with as much public humiliation as possible. And this is the first time in Matthew's Gospel that you hear the word explicitly, the cross. So Jesus' disciples, up to this point, may never have heard Jesus mention a cross. They might still not have known for definite that Jesus was going to die on a cross. This might be the first time they've heard him use the word. But here's the shock. The first time in Matthew's Gospel you hear the word cross, it is not Jesus talking about his own fate. It's him talking about his disciples' fate. He says, you need to take up your cross. The pain, the slowness, the humiliation on your back. Now what Jesus is doing here is he's setting his disciples' expectations. What is it going to feel like? What is it going to be like to follow after Jesus? Now, expectations are important. If you don't count the cost, you're unlikely to finish the course. I was out for dinner last week with Calvin, and we went to a little local pub, and we finished our meal, and the lassie came up and took our plates away, and she asked, how was the food? Calvin's reply was, if you have really low expectations, this place is great. Not a massive compliment to the lassie, but it is saying, if you went there expecting a Michelin star meal, and you got a £5 pub meal, you would have been hugely disappointed. But if you've got low expectations, this place is class. Some of us went to the Scotland game on Monday night. We absolutely battered Denmark, bossed the game, got the win, playoff place against a team that are 10th in the world and got to the semis of the Euros this year. The place was absolutely bouncing, boogieing. And as we're celebrating, a mate that we took with us had his little 9-year-old boy with him. And as we're celebrating at the end of the game, he turned to his son and he said, son, don't get used to this. Scotland are normally rubbish. Now, at one level you're going, just let the kid enjoy the moment. Let him dance away. Don't crush his dreams. But he's not crushing his dreams. He's setting his son's expectations. You won't last in the Tartan army if you think we're always this good. And Jesus is saying, listen, you've seen all the miracles, and you'll be tempted to think that it's always going to be like this. But you need to set your expectations now, so that when the suffering comes, you'll remember that the end of the race is worth it. Jesus drops the word cross, and with it he gets to the heart and to the hardest part of what it's going to be like to be a Christian. Following him might mean public humiliation. It might be really painful. It might be that you lose your life. You might lose your pals for acknowledging him. You might lose your family for loving him. You might lose your life following him. And Jesus says in verse 39, look at it, start of verse 39, whoever finds their life will lose it. What he's saying there is, there will be people who see how hard it is to become a Christian, and they just jack it in. They'll go and try and find life elsewhere. And you know what? For them and for us looking on, it will look like they've found life. They'll get their pals back, their family will be happy again, they might start driving a nicer car, they might look happy because they're back on the booze, or be escaping again back on the kit, and you'll think they look like they have found life. Jesus says, there is a way to live that looks like life, that is actually death. Even the ultimate earthly gains cannot outweigh the ultimate eternal loss. You ask yourself, is a lifetime of happiness and health worth losing your soul in hell for? There's a way of life that looks like life, but it's actually death. Don't live it. Second half of verse 39, Jesus says, whoever loses their life for me and my sake will find it. What he's saying is there's a way of life that looks like death that is actually life. Being a Christian is a bit like the person who's trying to lose weight. Loss is gain. He says to lose your life for Jesus is actually to find life in him. And let me be honest, this is probably the hardest part of my job, saying stuff like this. See, thinking about preaching this to you, knowing that you will have to live this out this week, has terrified me and plagued me with doubts. Here's why. I know that if you put into practice what I am preaching today, it will make your lives harder. So some of you might get absolutely slated at work or lose your jobs. Some of you might create enemies in your family. Some of you might have hard relationship decisions to make about who you spend your life with. Some of you might have to face up to things that you've been escaping from for a long, long time. And when I think about those hard choices, I start to think in my head, do I want that on my conscience? And I start to have doubts that go, what if Christianity isn't true? And I've not only wasted my life, but I've also inflicted division upon families and suffering within lives. And it makes me doubt everything. And I've battled this week. But then I read this guy. Listen to the question he asked. Do we believe the reward found in Jesus is worth the risk of following him? Do you believe the reward found in Jesus is worth the risk of following him? Let's be honest. If there is no eternal reward for following Jesus, then there is no earthly point in following Jesus. If you believe death is the end, don't follow Jesus. Because that would be a life of loss with no gain. If he didn't rise from the dead, don't die for him. But if his cross is followed by resurrection, that means death is not the end. If he rose to life, then he is the way to true life. And if the cross is followed by resurrection, then there is no cost that will not be worth it. If his resurrection reversed the death that his cross inflicted, healed the wounds that his cross imposed, wiped the tears that his cross caused, and if he gets ultimate gain from ultimate loss, then the reward found in him is worth the risk following him. The empty grave is proof that these promises are not empty. And his victory over death is the proof that your sacrifices for him will not be in vain. To lose your life following Jesus is to gain the eternal life won by Jesus. The cost on earth will be big. But you better believe the reward will be worth it. And the cost following Jesus will be high. But the cost for not following him will be higher. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for his sake will find the life that is truly life.